my dears, and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today I've got another book talk video to share with you guys. And today we are talking about The Death of Mrs. Westaway by Ruth Ware. Now, if you've been around my channel for a while, you might remember sometime last year I posted a book talk video on the book In a Dark, Dark Wood by Ruth Ware. That book's currently being made into a movie by Reese Witherspoon, who, as I mentioned in a recent video, seems to be making a ton of movies based on books. Which is cool, but I didn't know. Anyway, I didn't like that book, In a Dark, Dark Wood. I didn't like it at all. I thought it was really predictable and a bit boring, even though it was supposed to be kind of like a mystery and keep you on the edge of your seat. I know lots of people did like it, so I don't know, maybe it just wasn't my thing. Anyway, I won't go into the plot of that one, but I saw this at the store. And I thought to myself, okay, it's been a while. She's written some other books. She wrote one called The Woman in Cabin 10. She wrote another one, I think, called The Lying Game. Yeah, The Lying Game. And, you know, there's been a few books in between that one I read and this one. Let's give it a go. Because I don't hold any grudges. If I didn't like one of your books, that doesn't mean I'm going to write you off. I'll read another book. And I'm glad I did. I really enjoyed this one. Again, it's sort of a mystery, which I like. I like those sort of fast-paced reads, and this was a fast-paced read. I finished this in like a day and a half. And that's unusual for me. I usually take the whole week to read a book between when I film a book talk video and then the next one. That way I can just kind of take my time. But this, I couldn't put it down. So let's get into it. Our main character here in this book is a woman named Harriet, Hal for short. She lives in Brighton in the UK. She's a tarot card reader. She has a little booth down on the pier where she tells people's fortunes. She's a bit of a skeptic. She doesn't really believe it, but it's what her mother did before her. And you see, a few days before Hal's 18th birthday, her mother was killed in a car accident. Sort of a hit and run. Her mother was walking across the street and got killed. And when her mom died, Hal, of course, was very young, and she didn't know how she was going to support herself. So she just kind of slipped into the role of tarot card reader because it was something that she'd watched her whole life. You know, she'd go down to the booth with her mom and just watch her mom give readings. So it was a sort of no-brainer thing for her to do because she needed to make some money. She lives in the same apartment where she used to live with her mom. The day we meet her, it's a very cold, dreary day. We meet her as she's headed home. It's the slow season, of course. I think it's like November when the book starts. And let me just say too, this book is the perfect fall read. It's great for this time of year. It's got those sort of chilly fall vibes in it, and I love that. So she gets back to her apartment. We find out that she's got bills piling up. They're past due. She can barely make rent. She's having a really difficult time sort of just keeping her life together. So when she's going through the mail, she comes across this letter from an address that she doesn't know, but she can see that it's from a lawyer's office. So she reads the letter and she quickly learns that she's been named as a beneficiary in a will that belonged to someone who's claiming to be her grandmother. So she's like, well, that's weird. I never knew who my father was. And my mother's parents, you know, they died a long time ago. But the grandmother that's being named in this will has the same last name as her and her mother. So she's like, okay, this is weird. So she Googles the woman and finds out that this woman lives in a huge, like, sprawling estate. It's beautiful, and she starts to think, like, okay, clearly there's been some mistake here, but maybe I should just go and just see what happens. Because of course, when you are in desperate need and you are really struggling, the promise of some sort of inheritance would be very alluring of an idea. So she thinks, okay, it's probably not me that they're looking for, some sort of mix-up, but I'm just gonna go and see what happens. So the next day she kind of uses the final bit of money she has to her name to take the train to the town where this will reading is. So she goes and she meets the lawyer, and as it said in the letter, he said, you know, you can come on down and we'll open up a room in the house for you, and you can stay and go to the funeral and hear the will being read. So she gets there, and it's the day of the funeral, and so she meets up with the lawyer, and he says, okay, well, you know, she sort of explains if these people are her family, she's never met any of them or even heard about them. So he's like, okay, there's 3 sons. Their names are Ezra, Harding, and Abel. And they had a daughter, which was, of course, your mother, but she has passed on. So she goes to the funeral. It's very awkward. And then afterwards, she goes back to the house where she meets her uncles. And that's very awkward. So Ezra, the youngest son, he was the twin of her mother. And then Harding, he's the oldest. And then Abel is the one in the middle. So there's also a woman named Mrs. Weston, and she's sort of the caretaker of the estate. And before Mrs. Westaway died, Mrs. Weston cared for her for many years when she was very sick. And so she shows Hal up to her room. It's like this horrible room up in the attic, and it's freezing, and it's everything. It's very uncomfortable. But, you know, she's happy to have a place to stay, so she goes down and she starts to get to know her uncles a little bit more, her alleged uncles. So there's Harding, he's very cold. Abel's more friendly, and he has a partner named Edward who's also there with him. And then Ezra's sort of the younger, sort of sarcastic, cool uncle. And we learn that all 3 of these sons have had fallings out with their mother. They tell Hal stories about her, and they're not very pleasant. You know, she sounds like a really cold, difficult woman, and none of them are too sad that she's passed on. So as time goes by, you know, there's a lot of the book is dedicated to the building of these relationships between Hal and these uncles. Soon they're off to have the will read, and that's where things really kick off. We learn that $30,000 has been left to the caretaker, Mrs. Weston, which makes sense. $10,000 has been left to each of the grandchildren, and then it's read excluding Hal. And Hal, in her mind, she's kind of like, okay, that makes sense. You know, she didn't know me. You know, her feelings aren't hurt to be excluded from that $10,000 grandchild part. She's kind of like, okay, so I'm just mentioned in the will, I'm not left anything. And then the final thing gets read out, and it says that the rest of the estate has been left to Hal. The house, everything else has been left to Hal. And everyone's kind of like, what? And the lawyer's like, sorry, I don't know what to tell you. That's what the will says. And Hal, she is like, she's freaking out at this point. You know, in one second she'd come to terms with not being left anything, and in the next second she's the owner of this estate. And that's the end of the will. The brothers were left nothing, and Abel and Ezra are kind of like, good, I don't want anything, you know, like, I'm happy to be rid of this, have to never come back to this house ever again. But Harding, he's upset. At first, he's not too vocal about it to Hal, but over time, you know, it bleeds out, and she overhears some things of him calling her names like this gold digger, and on and on. And, but, you know, Hal says, and the other brothers say too, like, she had no idea. How is she a gold digger? Like, she didn't know this woman. She had no idea this was going to happen. So time goes on, and again, a lot of the book is dedicated to building these, you know, there's a lot of conversations between family members and whatnot. As we're getting to know Mrs. Weston more, she's really cruel to Hal. She's really mean, and we're not entirely sure why. At first, we're just kind of like, wow, like, she must be mad too about this whole estate being left to Hal. Maybe she thought that because she was the caretaker and the one who stuck around after her.
Did I just say stuck around.
The one who stuck around after the sons left, that she was going to be left the house. So we don't really know. And Hal just kind of, she's a little disturbed by it, but she lets it go. After a bit, Abel approaches Hal and gives her a picture. And he says, I thought you might like to have this picture. It was from a really good day. He says, back then, things were rough, but this was a good day. And she looks at the picture, and in the picture she can figure out that there's Ezra and Abel, and then Hal's mom, and then another girl. And the thing is, it's the other girl that Hal recognizes as her mom. And the one who's the sister of these brothers is clearly, like you can see looking at the picture, that her and Ezra are clearly twins. So it's the other woman that Hal recognizes as her mom. And she's kind of like, oh my god. So she takes a minute and then she asks Abel, she says, oh, who's this other girl? And he says, oh, that's Maggie. She was like a distant cousin, and she came to stay with us that year. And he's like, a funny thing was, even though they were just cousins, they both had the same first name, because it's a family name. So Hal's thinking about this, and she's putting together the pieces, and she's like, okay, well, first of all, that's where the mix-up came from, because both women had the same name, Margarita Westaway. So the mix-up became a little clearer because the lawyer probably wouldn't know about this distant cousin, right? So she's like, okay, she's trying to figure out what to do. She now knows for sure that her mom is not the sister. So she's not the granddaughter. She shouldn't have inherited this money. So she takes a day or two and she's kind of trying to figure out what to do. And meanwhile, throughout the book, every few chapters, we're given a diary excerpt. We're given a diary excerpt from Maggie's old diary from the year that she was pregnant. And that was the year she was living in the house. And so we're given little glimpses of what was going on in the house at that time. How Maggie and Maud, which is what the men's sister's nickname was. So it was Maggie and Maud, and that was to keep them separate from the full name being the same. So she learns that things were rough that year, that Mrs. Westaway was horrible to Maud and Maggie. And then once Mrs. Westaway got word that Maggie was pregnant, she was just extra cruel to her. And she stayed up in the room where Hal is now staying. And Hal notices, like, there's locks on the door, but they lock from the outside. And, like, there's just a lot of weird things about the room. And she even notices at one point, sort of etched into the windowsill are the words, "Help me." And it's like, oh my god. So obviously some really bad, intense things happened in that room and in that house during the time Maggie was staying with them. So Hal eventually decides that, like, this is bad news. Like, I need to tell them the truth and then get out of here. So she does. She tells them, she's like, guys, I'm sorry. I'm Maggie's daughter, not Maud's. And that kind of sets it all into a tailspin again. And at first they're mad at Hal and they're like, why did you let this go on for so long? And so she sort of explains, like, I came from this family. It was just me and my mom. She never spoke of her childhood, of her past. She had the same full name as the woman who was the sister. She's like, I had to come and see because I didn't know for a fact that I wasn't the granddaughter. So they're all kind of appeased by that. They're like, okay, that makes sense. So through the night, Hal kind of gets spooked and she's like, you know what, I need to get out of here. So she steals away in the night and goes home to Brighton. And she's like, okay, like, she says as soon as she left the house, it was like a weight lifted off her shoulders. She felt like, okay, I can breathe again. I'm free. Everything's fine. So she gets home and she's going through her mother's paperwork, and that's where she finds the journal that Maggie had kept that summer when she was in the house. And she's reading through it, and there's a lot of weird things. Like, the one bit of information that Hal's really trying to find as she's going through this journal is the identity of her father. And she's going through it, and she's trying to find it. And so eventually she starts to piece together who might have been there that wasn't in the photo. Like, who was taking the photo? Because at first she gets this idea that maybe it was Abel. Maybe Abel was her father. But the more she's looking at the picture that was taken that day, she notices that her mother is staring very lovingly and longingly at whoever was taking the photo. And as she's reading through the journal pages, she gets the, she pieces it together, and she realizes that Edward, Abel's partner, was there. And she's like, that's who she's looking at. Ed's my father. So she calls Hal, and she sort of apologizes. She says, look, I'm sorry. I freaked out. I left. I'm trying to piece together more of my life story, and I want to come back and spend a bit more time with you guys and just try to put it all together. So he, at this point, is kind of jovial about it, because he knows that now that she's out of the will, he might be back on track to get, you know, what he considers his portion of it all. So he's like, yes, come back. Like, you might not be our sister's daughter, but you're still family, and you have a family in us now. So she's like, great. So he sends her money to take the train back, and, you know, she starts really researching, trying to find answers. And at one point, Miss Weston is like, who's still being rude to her, she walks by, sort of bumps her, and mumbles something under her breath, and Hal can't be sure, but she thinks she says, get out now while you still can. And Hal's like, well, that's a weird thing to say to somebody. And throughout this, I might not be portraying it well, but throughout this, there's this growing dread. And the house itself kind of becomes a character, with its darkened doorways and its creaky stairs and everything like that. You kind of get that whole haunted house vibe. It's not a haunted house. There's no, like, ghosts in this story, but the house itself kind of gives off the vibe of being a haunted house. And I love that. I love haunted house stories. So I liked that element of it as well. So the dread's really building, but we don't really know why. It's kind of like this unnamed dread. And we're just trying to figure everything out. And at one point, one night, Hal gets locked in her room, and she's trying to get out. When she finally does, she trips on the stairs, and she hits her head. And once she lands, she kind of looks around, and if she had fallen another way, she would have hit her head on cement, and, like, it would have killed her. So anyway, eventually the next day she addresses Abel, and she asks him who was taking the photo that he gave her. And she wants confirmation. And he's like, I don't remember. And she's like, is it Edward? Was it Edward? And he's like, I don't think so. She's like, okay, it's weird. Eventually, after she finds out all she thinks she's going to, she decides it's time to go back home. Like, she knows in her heart that Edward's her father. So she kind of thinks, well, what else am I going to do? I might as well go home. And there's a snowstorm coming, so she asks Ezra, who's leaving. Ezra's like, I need to get the hell out of here. I'm done with this. I need to go. So he's like, you know what, I'll drop you off at the train station. So she's like, thank you. So Ezra's driving her, and they get to the train station. He drops her off. She goes inside. All the trains have been canceled, and she's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So she goes outside to see if Ezra's still there, but he isn't. So she's like, oh my god, like, I'm going to freeze. I have nowhere to go, no money to go anywhere, even if I did have somewhere to go. I don't know what I'm going to do. And then it turns out that Ezra had just been turning the car around, and he comes back and he's like, what are you doing outside? And she's like, oh my god. She tells him, and he said, okay, hop in. I will take you to Brighton. It's on my way, or it's not on his way, but it's not too far out of his way. He's like, I don't mind, I'll take you to Brighton. She's like, okay, great. And After they've been driving for a bit, they stop for a coffee and they go in and they have a bit of a chat, and she decides she's going to ask Ezra who was taking the photo. So he shows him the photo and she says, you know, who was the photographer? And he says, why are you asking these questions? And she says, I need to know. I have a right to know where I come from. And he's being weird about it. He's like, listen, I think you should stop asking questions and let's go. So she's a little freaked out at this point, and they keep driving, and eventually they get to a point where they're kind of like, I'm not going to get any further. I need to turn back. And he's a little irritated with that he has to turn back because he really wants to get her to Brighton, drop her off, have this be done with. You get the feeling that he's really getting very nervous about her snooping around. And now, if you don't want spoilers, here I'm going to suggest you click away from this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, this is a fun, quick read. There's a lot of good mystery. It keeps you guessing. When you think you've guessed, you haven't. And that's what I love. I don't like being able to guess what's going to happen. So, thanks for watching. And now let's get into the spoilers. So, they turn around. They go back to Trespassing House, which is the name of the estate. They go in the house. Ezra's like, hope you don't mind, I'm going straight to bed. And she's like, sure, yeah, I am too. So she goes to bed, she's laying there, and she can't get to sleep. So she goes downstairs. She remembers at an earlier date she saw in one of the rooms a photo album. And she had flipped through it a little bit, but not much. So she decided she's going to go down and take a look at the photo album and see if she can figure anything out. So she goes through, and at one point in the journal, what really solidified her belief that Edward was her father is that her mom's writing in the journal, and she refers to the father of the baby as Ed. She's going through the photo album. She's seeing pictures of Harding, of Abel, of Ezra, and of Maud. And she's looking at the backs of the photos to get a feel for the dates. And she takes out one of the twins, and on the back it says, like, their initials, their first and middle name initials. And so say Maud's was, I don't know, I can't remember what her middle, but say it was like Maud Marie, it would be like MM and ED. And the ED were Ezra's initials for Ezra Daniel. And she's like, oh my God. ED wasn't short for Ed. It was her mom's way of writing Ezra Daniel without straight out saying who the father was. One other thing that's really weird that happens while she's looking through this photo album is she discovers that no, the woman who, her mother, wasn't the Maggie, it was the Maud. As she's looking at photos, of Ezra and his twin growing up. She realizes no, the woman she knows as her mother is Maud, not Maggie. Though Maggie was the one who technically gave birth to her. And so she's panicking. So she decides to go to look for Mrs. Weston to see if Miss Weston has any info. And then she goes in and she finds that Miss Weston has been murdered. And she's like, oh my God. And she turns around and there's Ezra, and he is like, oh my Lord. Like, why did you have to keep digging and digging this? Why? Like, why did you do this? Now I have to kill you. And she's like, what? It's also around this point, too, that she puts it together that Ezra was actually the one who killed her mother, hitting her with the car. And the reason he did that was because she had written home to tell her mother that she was going to tell Hal the truth about her birth mother and who her father was, and he couldn't have that. Then he attacks her physically and is trying to kill her. Luckily, after a lot of pursuit, like he chases her out of the house, across the garden, and then onto the frozen lake, which when Ezra gets out there, it turns out it's not so frozen, and he falls through. After that, she wakes up and she's in the hospital. And when she's there, other siblings are there, and like Harding and Abel and Harding's wife, and they're there and they're supporting her, and they're telling her, you know, thank God you're okay. And they kind of fill in the blanks for her, because of course, as with any family with a ton of history, sometimes more family members know than you think, and they all just sort of keep it quiet. So what she finds out is this. She finds out that yes, Ezra is her father. They weren't 100% sure of that, but now they are. And like Harding kind of says, he's like, you know, you get feelings about things. You think things are off about people, but you don't know for sure. But he says, you know, yeah, Ezra was your father, Maggie was your mother. Maggie and Maud moved away. They ran away as soon as they were old enough. And he says, you know, some of us haven't seen either of them since. What she finds out is that after she was born, her and Maggie came back to Trespassing House one time. And while she was there, Ezra sort of confronts her. You know, I don't know why you're not returning my calls, why you're rejecting me all of a sudden. And he goes to kiss her, and she pushes him away. And that just really sets him off. And he goes to kiss her again, and he puts his hands around her throat. And then he pulls his hands away, and she was dead. And so they're down in the boathouse, and he puts her in the water, which ironically is also where he went down. And so Harding kind of tells her, like, our mother must have known that. Our mother must have known what happened, and that's why you're named in the will, and that's why you've been left such a substantial inheritance. Because to her, this was the only way she knew how to apologize for that. What happens after that is that Maud got word of the accident, and she came and she took Hal, the baby, and she left. She went back to Brighton, where Maggie had her apartment, and she decides to raise Hal on her own. And because she knows that if she doesn't take that baby and go and stay away, that somehow Ezra will end up with custody of that child, because he is the only living parent. And there was no way she was going to let that happen, because she knew that there's something very wrong with Ezra. But her mother just protected him, as did Miss Weston. She knew that you know, there was something off with him, but she loved him because she had raised him alongside Mrs. Westaway since he was a baby. So that's kind of where it ends. With Ezra dead, Hal getting her inheritance finally, and knowing that she has family with these people. You know, they make that very clear to her, which is nice. So there you go. That's the story. I would recommend it if you love a good mystery and, you know, you like a quick-paced read. The characters are good. I really enjoyed, like I said, a lot of the book was conversations between these people, and sometimes that can get a bit tedious if it's not well done, and this was really well done. And I enjoyed it a lot. I thought Hal was a great character. I thought all the brothers, I thought their characters were done really well. Even the, you know, character portrait of Mrs. Westaway, a character who's already passed when the book begins, was very well done. And yeah, I would definitely recommend it. So yeah, thanks so much for watching, you guys. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday. Bye.